Good morning, everybody. You're tuned in to Cragcore. Thank you for tuning in today. Today's Sunday, the 29th of January, 2023. And we're smashing through this year, man. It's going quick time, isn't it? So today we're going to be talking about perception and how that manifests into our reality. Now, as y'all know, I've been looking into David Hawkins' work just briefly, just scratching the surface, and Andreas Moritz again, scratching the surface, but it seems the more I scratch away at the pithy outer layer, more and more parallels become apparent. Because it's bridging the gap between spirituality and science. And that is where people like Ken Wilber and Doshin Roshi come in, because they talk about this subject, bridging the gap between spirituality and science, as a way of integrating our society into one format. And it's this fissure between the two, this schism that's happened in our society, where these things have become separate, that has kind of stunted our evolution in many ways. So their integral Zen theory is based around integrating all these things. And then when you start looking at people like David R. Hawkins, and you realise, and Andreas Moritz, man, pioneers, you realise that what they're talking about, the reason why it makes so sense is because that's the very thing that they're doing. They are bridging the gap between spirituality and science and making it one whole thing. It's fascinating. Now, at the start of Cancer is Not a Disease, which is a book by Andreas Moritz, he's talking about how the very disease itself is a physical manifestation of trauma, of emotional and mental trauma. And then it's a warning sign that perhaps you need to make some changes and do some inner work so as to alleviate yourself from this spiritual, mental, emotional trauma, so that you can be rid of the physical manifestation of that, which is showing itself to you as the cancerous growth. Now, that's one side of it. Now, Dr. Hawkins also says this. He also says that physical ailments, even back to the Dark Ages, have been directly linked to the way you feel. And the way you feel is based on the way you perceive. You can perceive any situation any way you want, but it depends on where you calibrate at on the scale of your own personal growth, your own personal journey through life, and where you are on how you perceive things. If you perceive things constantly at the level of fear, well then the way you see things, you will always be afraid of things, It's very simple. If you perceive things through the perception of love, unconditionally, well then you will be loving surrounding any situation that comes to you. And those who think that that's impossible, well, you're not there yet, because it is. Anything's possible. You have to accept that. But this guy, anyway, Dr. David Hawkins, he says that there are certain places in the brain, certain parts of the actual physical brain, that deal with certain parts of the actual physical body and regulate those parts of the body, organs and so forth. And there's certain parts of the brain that are stimulated by certain different aspects of trauma, then create pathways in the brain. You create pathways in the brain by continually experiencing and perceiving things through this perception, this traumatic perception, this level of wherever you are. Now, ultimately, if you keep perceiving things through that level, that lower vibrational level of perception, that traumatic state, you keep reliving it, and you've then created the pathway within that brain, well then ultimately that part of the brain is constantly creating the certain stimuli for the part of the body which it relates to. Therefore, people's ailments within that part of the body directly related to the trauma that they're feeling. And I mean, in this, you can find charts on the internet. Go and look it up. You can find body maps on the internet, and it says which part of the body, which organ, and all these things is directly related physically with regards to ailments and cancers and all these kind of things to which part of the brain, and therefore the trauma that goes with it. So if you've got bereavement trauma, well then you don't put that to bed, you don't work through it, and you continually feel and relive that bereavement trauma, then you will likely have in the future ailments within this area of the body, and so forth. That's how it works. So again, it's all about perception and how you perceive a situation. And this is why I believe it's very important that we do things like self-work and ask yourself why it is you're perceiving something a certain way. And maybe it's not even that, perhaps. Perhaps it's not even why. Perhaps it's just because. Ask yourself, just acknowledge that you're seeing it that way, and ask yourself, can you see it in a different way? How would this look if I perceived this in a different way? For instance, through the perception of acceptance, forgiveness, willingness, love, all of these things. Because once you start doing that, you find yourself moving past these things, and therefore moving past the risks of any physical ailment. Now, obviously, this isn't a miracle cure. It's not just because you live your life enlightened, or what the commonly accepted vibe for what enlightened is. If you live your life in a state of awareness, shall we say, of yourself, and you move through trauma relatively quickly because you're able to perceive it from a higher vibrational calibration, well then ultimately this doesn't mean to say that you will be free of any and all physical ailments, because ultimately we all succumb to old age eventually. Our bodies aren't infinite, but you see, through your awareness, you see that the body isn't infinite, but ultimately we are, and that it's okay. Physical death is quite simply a stage in our lives, and once you reach a certain point, you have to accept this, because you come to the realization that if what you experience isn't wholly physical, if your physical experience is actually impacted upon by your spiritual, mental, emotional, and ethereal state, well then quite clearly there is more than the physical, right? The physical state is a slave, for all intents and purposes, to the spiritual and to the mental. I mean, if you believe, like myself, that the physical body is quite simply a translator, it allows your spiritual self to interact with the physical world a little bit in reverse, like how in the opposite way a virtual reality headset and VR kind of gloves or controllers or what have you want to call them allow you to interface with the electronic computer game world. That in itself, you know, kind of shows how this is. Because obviously your physical body is trying to, in that case, interact with something that's non-physical. So it's like a translator, it's a bridge between. Whereas your non-physical self, your spiritual self, your emotional self is using this physical body, this brain, you know, your eyes, your ears, to interact with the physical world in such a way that allows it to experience. And it's through that experience that our bodies, that our spiritual selves evolve and learn. So, considering that the learning never stops and evolution is quite possibly infinite, man, you'd have to assume then that this isn't your only life, that you've either had or are going to have. So just going back a step, you know, to the physical manifestations through your emotional and spiritual level kind of thing, you know, perception. It would therefore then stand to reason then that the physical body and the physical elements are also then here as a tool, considering that then it's a translation device for your own personal learning. It stands to reason then that physical elements, if they manifest from the spiritual and from the emotional as a way to get you to kind of see that you perhaps have personal growth to do in one or two aspects of your life, it stands to reason then, doesn't it, that this is the case, you know, that it's alerting you to where you need to be looking within yourself as a way of spiritual and emotional evolution, so that you can release yourself of the baggage, the karma, the karmic ties, so that you can potentially evolve past this negative experience, this negative, seemingly negative. But you see, that's the thing again. Perception, man. I mean, this world, we perceive it as being inherently negative. But if everything's a manifestation of what we need, which is my next point, by the way, well, then it stands to reason also that the world is so perceptively negative, quite simply because we need it to be that negative or perceptively negative in order for us to be forced to rise up out of our slumber in the ways like that have got us here in the first place. Because if we've been so ignorant to ourselves and our own personal evolution for so long that it requires the world around us to become so perceptively wrong and anti what it is we're about, well, then that goes to show, in the sense of reflection at least, how bad our state or how bad our requirement for personal evolution has become, how desperate our need now is. I mean, everything comes full circle. Time is not linear, it's all a sphere. So in that sense, you would have to expect then that everything that happens is for a reason, and it will all make sense as it comes back around. Hence the visualization of the karmic wheel, etc. Now, David Hawkins. I always say Robert because his name's David R. Hawkins. But it's Robert Dawkins, isn't it? That's the other guy. Anyway, David Hawkins says that because of the pathways that are created in the brain by constantly reliving and re-experiencing past traumas, that the brain then, almost like an addict, seeks out scenarios, therefore making you behave a certain way seems a little bit schizophrenic, but the brain is ultimately your translator for this world, and unless you're aware of that, you can be blindly led through the physical, by the physical wants, needs and desires. And the brain is, being obviously of physical in nature, part of that system. So in a sense, I guess it does kind of create situations for itself through getting you, the person, you, the driver of this machine, to act in certain ways, to do certain things which feed it with that chemical, with that experience that allows the stimulus of that part of the brain, which has now become accustomed to being activated. So therefore, if you're always depressed, and this is what triggered me to this video, because I did a video a while back called The Depression Demon, and if you watch that, I do say that the depression is a bit like a demon that hangs around, that gets you to do things in a certain way so that it can feed off the energy that provides. So therefore you get this constant feedback loop where you're doing things to make you feel depressed so that the depression can remain alive, because anything that has life doesn't want to die. But I guess in a scientific sense, David Hawkins puts it across like this, and he says that the brain will ultimately become stimulated in such a way that it becomes natural for the brain to want to remain stimulated by that, by those actions. So then you will find yourself doing things, I suppose subconsciously in some respects, or unwittingly, to keep on stimulating that part of the brain. So you will seek out naturally scenarios, almost like self-sabotage. So then your reality then manifests quite simply through your motivations and actions, that which the brain is pushing for through its need for stimulus, a bit like a sugar addict. You constantly are drawn to the sweets when you go to a shop, and you feel better when you've had them, but then you feel worse because you've eaten sweets and you feel like you're going to gain weight. So you go through this constant cycle of depression, and then eating on that depression, and then feeling depressed because you've eaten. It's a double negative, and it makes no sense, but it's what we do. Again, it's a cycle. So if you accept then that your physical reality is a direct manifestation of how you perceive And that perception can be altered by the connections, or by at least the pathways that you've created in your brain by giving into trauma constantly. Well, then quite simply, what we need to do is work through our traumas. You need to work through our traumas so that we can create new pathways in our brains, so that our brains no longer seek out the stimuli for those parts of the brains which create this negative feedback loop within ourselves, and therefore give us physical ailments which, because for the most part the necessity for that is beyond the reach of most people's perceptions, we allow to kill us. And that's how important this is. You know, people talk nowadays about manifestation being a magical thing. It's not. It's simply about changing your perception. And once you start changing your perception, you make different pathways in the brain, which then seek out ways for that pathway to be stimulated. Therefore, you act on a different level, you perceive things differently, and as you start to act on a different level, your perception will change. And as your perception changes, you act differently. And it's a constant step in the right direction now, as opposed to the wrong direction. One that is proactive rather than one that is inactive and counteractive to who you actually need to be. So if we change our perception in life, and you can ask yourself, is it possible for me to see things in a slightly different way? Can I actually, look at these bad things that I thought were bad that happened and see them as a way to look at ourselves through a different light? Maybe say to ourselves, can I see this through the perception of acceptance, or like I said, through love, or through learning, anything like this? And if you can get rid of the negativity that goes along with that and see it as something that was positive, well, then you're starting to work through, and your perception in life will change. You will be a happier person, quite simply because you're seeing things through the happier perspective. And then better things will happen in your life. And it's not about blaming other people here. It's about looking at ourselves. Because blame is negative action, negative inaction. And introspectiveness is positive proaction. We are the drivers here. We're the captains of our own ship. And as little mini organisms within a bigger whole, the microcosmic to the macrocosmic, we have the potential, only us have the potential to change ourselves and the world around us. And when you look at how bad the world is through that perception of how bad it is, if you see it as being just a bad world, well, then you will constantly require the need to change your perception. And you will constantly then live within that bad world. If you see it as a world that is begging you to wake up, that's begging you to change your perception, to look past that, well, then it will allow you to do so, and it will become a tool in your life, so that you can now move past that negative perspective and move into a positive one, and therefore start manifesting and creating a more positive existence for yourself and the whole world. It's up to us, man. And it starts from looking at your very own small experiences in life. We can look at it on a greater whole, the greater macrocosmic view of the world. But that comes into play when you deal with the microcosmic you. And just because you're the microcosm doesn't mean to say that you're any less important than the macro, because without you there is no macrocosm. So you're just as important as everybody else and everything else. In fact, you're the most important part of this, because it starts with you. And without you, there cannot be any personal revolution. So think on that. And on that note, I'm going to wish love and peace to all things everywhere. This is Crack Course signing off. Peace.